I should never have snuck out that night. My best friend Jasper dared me to do it, and we made a $100 bet on who would chicken out. It was a dark and stormy night. The wind howled through the trees, shaking the leaves and sending chills down the spine of anyone who dared to venture outside. I grew up in Parkins, specifically Grove Road, my entire life, and up to that point I had never left my small town. Jasper and I had been friends since kindergarten. We grew like siblings and did everything together. Even when we started high school and Jasper became popular with the girls, we never grew apart. We were always looking for adventure. So when Jasper dared me to take a walk around the neighborhood on the one night of the year that everyone locked their doors in fear, how could I say no? We would be heroes at school if we could prove it. Well, we kinda dared each other. The deal was we would walk in opposite directions around the block until we got to the old abandoned house, where we would leave a sign that we had been there for the other to find the next day. The plan was to return to the old house the next day to see if we had both actually done it, and the loser gets to pay the winner $100. We had been saving for weeks to get the $100 for the wager, and it needed to be worth it as it was the most dangerous night of the year. We didn't know what happened to people who didn't stay home on that night, except that they were never seen again. But we did know that it had something to do with the ancient spirit or beast that was rumored to be set free to roam on that special night. Of course, I didn't believe in the spirits. Most young people, like us, thought it was nothing more than a legend, anyways. But it was whispered among the older folk that every year on the night, February 25, an ancient evil walked free, and anyone caught was fair game as a sacrifice to Satan ancient hunger. According to the stories, our ancestors once prayed to this beast for protection, and in return they would take their payment in blood on one night of the year. While most of the town had moved away from such lore, there were still a few families that believed that this ancient evil still collected its pound of flesh on February 25 each year. As I walked down the deserted street, I was brave at first as I chuckled softly to myself at the thought of the $100 bill I was going to collect from Jasper tomorrow. At first, the darkness and the shadows did not scare me as I traveled from street lamp to street lamp. There was some comfort in the sound of the night insects, the owls and the frogs. They had a calming effect on me. But the further I got from my house, the harder it became to shake the feeling that I was being watched, maybe even followed. Jasper, I called out. Quit playing. Come on, man. I got no response from Jasper. The wind whistled eerily and I zipped up my jacket against it before setting off again. I quickened my pace, but the eerie feeling only grew stronger. That's when I realized that the night had fallen dead silent. I had stopped hearing the crickets, and I could no longer hear the frogs. The air felt colder, like ice shards as it licked and scratched at my hands and face. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing there, just the darkness of the night and the street lamps and silent houses in the distance. The trees seemed to shiver from the cold as I took in my surroundings. Just as I was about to continue on my way, I felt a cold claw-like hand scrape across my shoulder. I was sure the nails or claws pierced my flesh. I whirled around, but all I saw was a pair of glowing eyes, for a split second, staring back at me before the figure vanished. A chilling laugh echoed in my ears, and a wet, musty, thick, almost dog-like scent filled my lungs. I could almost taste the wet fur when I smelled it. The odor was so intense, it was almost like a really large dog, maybe even with a wound. Or a pack of dogs. I started to pull away. I could sense swift but shuffling movement in nearby bushes. I knew that I was not alone on this lonely street. So I turned on my heels and ran as fast as I could. After a few paces, I started to hear footsteps behind me. It didn't sound entirely like human footsteps. There was some scratching accompanying each footfall, almost like the feet had long nails, like a dog that needs a nail clipping. I ran with all my might as the sharp wind made tiny paper cuts on my cheeks. I was thankful for the slight head start, but I could tell that the creature was faster. It chased me through the streets, its footsteps getting closer and closer with each passing second. With every step I took, I could hear the growling, gurgling sounds behind me. I have never heard a dog, wolf, or bear sound like that. I could feel the rancid heat of its breath on my back, a seeping heat that smelled of death. Oh God, oh God, oh God. Just when I thought I was going to be caught, I spotted a dim light in the distance. I ran towards it, hoping it was a sign of safety. As I got closer, I realized that it was the street lamp just outside the old abandoned house Jasper and I were supposed to leave our mark at. I hesitated for a moment, but the creature was right behind me, so I had no choice but to go inside. The door creaked open and I rushed inside, slamming it shut. I leaned against the door, panting and trying to catch my breath. But as I looked around the dark and musty room, I realized that I might have just trapped myself, making it easier for whatever was out there trying to catch me. Panic flooded through my pores and washed me in a cold sweat. I heard the creature scratching at the door, and I knew that I was in for a long and terrifying night. I stood in the dark and musty room, trying to remember everything I ever heard about the beast, but my mind was drawing blanks. As I said, I never paid much attention to old wives' tales. But now my heart was pounding in my chest. I tried to think of a way to escape the creature that was outside. That was when I remembered that I had a flashlight in my pocket, and I quickly pulled it out and turned it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, and I could see that I was in an old living room. There was a couch, a coffee table, and a fireplace, but there were also cobwebs and dust everywhere. I looked around for a weapon, but all I could find was a fireplace poker, so I picked it up and held it tightly, trying to steady my shaking hands. I could hear the creature scratching at the door, and I knew that it was only a matter of time before it broke through. I started to back away, moving towards the staircase that led to the upper floor. Halfway up the stairs, there was the sound of wood splintering, then bursting inwards as the door gave way and creature crashed into the house with me. I started to run up the stairs as quickly as I could. I could feel the creature's hot breath on my neck. I knew that I had to act fast. At the top of the stairs, I saw a door that looked like it led to a bedroom, so I ran towards it, hoping to find some kind of shelter. I burst into the room and slammed the door shut behind me, but not before something inhuman slipped inside too. As I turned around, I realized that I was not alone. There, standing in the corner of the room, was the creature. It was tall and lanky, looking like an emaciated dog human hybrid, but rotting. I was surprised at how fast it was for how it looked. It looked like it should not have been able to move. It looked like some unholy corpse. It had glowing red eyes, dead pallid skin that clung to its skeleton. It had rotting fur in patches and a mouth full of sharp, discolored teeth. I screamed and backed away, but the beast lunged at me, its claws extended. I swung the fireplace poker at it, but it easily dodged the blow. Just when I thought I was going to be killed, I heard a loud crash from downstairs. The creature stopped and turned its head towards the sound. It snarled and growled, then disappeared down the stairs. I was left alone, trembling and scared. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew that I had to get out of there. I ran to the window and pushed it open, then climbed outside, back into the stormy night. As I ran through the streets, I was convinced that I could still hear the creature's angry snarls behind me, over the sound of rain and wind in my ears. Although that might have been my imagination. I can't say for sure. But I didn't stop to check. I ran until I reached the safety of my home and I locked the door behind me. The next day, I got the news that Jasper was missing. I never got to cash in on that $100 wager, and I never told anyone of the bet. 12 years later, Jasper was never found. But the police did find one of his sneakers in the old abandoned house. It was his favorite pair, the left foot of his Nike Air Force One with blue laces. When my parents saw the scar where the beast punctured my shoulder, they said nothing, but they were visibly horrified. I moved away from Parkins that year to live with an aunt, vowing never to return. and my parents went along with my decision, citing my trauma of never knowing what happened to my best friend to anyone who asked about my whereabouts. But this year, my mother fell ill and was unable to come to me, so I decided to put my childish fears behind me and go back to Parkins to see her. I never spoke of that horrible night again, but the memory of the creature's glowing red eyes will stay with me for the rest of my life. Yesterday was February 25 again, and I'm back in Grove Road, Parkins, to visit my parents. Last night was another dark and stormy night, as I shuttered myself in my old childhood bedroom. As the storm raged, the old scar on my shoulder ached and throbbed all through the night. It was almost as if the creature was attacking me all over again. I started to have flashes of myself as the beast running through the night, growling, hungry for human flesh. I felt ravenous as my long, patchy fur clung to my cold, rotting skin. There was a girl and a boy, two teenagers, fooling around in their car. There was a lot of blood, screaming. I tasted their flesh and I enjoyed it. I can still feel their hot blood in my mouth and flowing down my face. These images right now are still flashing through my mind. I can't tell if it was a dream. Did I really go out there last night? Was I that beast? No, that's ridiculous. This morning, February 26, I woke up in a barn 3 miles away from my parents' house. I was bloody. There were a few patches of fur mixed with blood on the ground around me. The scar on my shoulder felt raw with ache, but the pain felt like it was slowly fading, unlike the excruciating feeling from last night. Confused, I ran back home before the sun rose completely and cleaned myself up before my parents woke up. I found Jasper's other shoe on our doorstep. The blue laces were faded and the shoes were deteriorating with age. But the strangest thing is that there was a rolled up $100 bill inside. "Let me out," he said, but the once friendly couple who gave this hitchhiker a ride just laughed sinisterly. I glanced mischievously at my husband, then I looked at the hitchhiker and said, "Didn't your mother ever tell you about stranger danger, kid?" The old man caressed his rifle gently and tut-tutted, shaking his head in fake sympathy. "Oh God, oh God," the hitchhiker whimpered, his voice shaking. "The old gods or these new gods?" Michael grilled the boy, taunting him. "The old gods are with us," I hissed. "Most kids his age believe in all this new age BS. I glanced at him over my shoulder. Michael and I grew up hearing fantastical stories from our parents and grandparents about the old gods. Gods like Daggerat, the Slayer, and the like of Vashtur, god of war and pestilence. While we didn't worship these gods ourselves, the stories always brought us comfort and a sense of belonging and self-awareness. I guess it's true what they say about knowing your history and understanding where you come from. "Please let me go, you don't have to do this." I took a sharp turn onto a dirt road as I spoke to the hitchhiker again. "Have to? Oh, we know we don't have to, son, but we want to." I smiled at him through the rear view mirror and he visibly winced. Is it me? Is it my face? I know my husband and I aren't as attractive as we were when we were young, but I still didn't think we were that old. Well, I'll admit that my once smooth skin is now starting to show some lines. I mean, what do you expect? We're in our 70s, for Christ's sake. But at least tonight I can do my human blood face mask. It works wonders to smooth out these wrinkles, especially when I add collagen. He looks so youthful. Perfect. I remember being as young and full of life as him. How old is he? Maybe 25 at most? Why, I just want to go home, please. When is he going to stop this moping? I swear, the women hold up better in these situations. Men just seem to turn into blithering idiots as soon as they lose control of a situation. My husband, Michael, he tries not to be like that, but I know for sure that if I wasn't present at a few crucial moments over the years, we would have been caught decades ago. We slowly approached the old cabin. We drove up the long driveway lit by torches on both sides. Our guests usually like our old-time lanterns until they get a little closer. The hitchhiker shifted position to get a better look. Michael gripped my thigh in anticipation. I could tell that he was struggling not to laugh, even as the corners of my own lips curled upward. The hitchhiker squinted and peered through a crack. That's when he noticed that what he thought were old-time lanterns were human skulls on stakes with candles inside. We did it for the atmosphere. The hitchhiker kicked frantically at the door of the van when he saw the scene and his new reality set in. I could hear his screams from the front seat as I drove us up the long driveway. My heart raced with excitement as we got closer to the cabin. This was always my favorite part, the highest point of the anticipation build-up before we could play. But as we pulled up to the cabin, the hitchhiker continued to lash out at the vehicle, kicking and hurling his body into the door and sides like a madman. Just before we trundled to a halt, the back door flew open and the hitchhiker threw himself onto the ground. He managed to escape from the van and ran into the woods. Michael and I exchanged a quick look, then jumped out of the van and started chasing him. We were old, but we were also experienced. We knew these woods like the back of our hands, and we were determined to catch our prey. The hitchhiker was fast, but we were better. We knew every corner and every hole in which the very rodents nest in at night. We had booby traps everywhere, so we didn't really need speed. We could literally have strolled hand in hand like lovers down Les Champs-Élysées on a beautiful night. But we just loved the chase. We could hear his ragged breaths as he ran through the brush, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. As Michael and I chased the hitchhiker through the woods, a sense of power and control washed over me. It was exhilarating to be in pursuit of someone, to have the upper hand. We were the predators and he was our prey. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins, fueling my every step. The thrill of the chase was intoxicating, and I reveled in it. We were in our element, in control of the situation, and it was a heady feeling. Every time I caught a glimpse of the hitchhiker ahead of us, my heart raced with excitement. We were so close to capturing him, and it was only a matter of time before he was in our grasp. I could feel the power of our experience and cunning as we closed in on him. We chased him for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. The adrenaline was pumping through our veins, and we were both getting winded. The hitchhiker was starting to slow down, and I could see him glancing over his shoulder at us, terror in his eyes. But we were gaining on him, and I could see the realization dawning on him that he wasn't going to escape. He stepped on a bear trap. The snap was crisp, the sound of mechanical jaws shutting. He was a bug, helpless, caught in the jaws of a Venus flytrap. The boy instantly dissolved into agony, wailing like a wounded animal where no one could hear him. The hitchhiker fell to the ground and Michael was on him in an instant. I could hear him shouting at the hitchhiker, his voice booming through the woods. I was a few steps behind Michael and I could just now really take in the hitchhiker's face up close for the first time. His eyes were wide with fear and his cheeks were streaked with sweat and tears and dirt. But there was something else beyond that. Beyond his fear, I saw contempt. I saw judgment. And for a second, I felt damned. He was shaking all over, and I could hear him whimpering as Michael tied his hands behind his back. The hitchhiker started to mumble, "He's coming, I can feel it. And when he does, no one is safe." "What did you say, son? Who's coming?" Michael inquired with amusement. "He who comes to test the heart of man." Michael and I looked at each other, puzzled, then back at the boy. Trying to get any more answers out of him was like talking to a wall. He decidedly kept his mouth shut, refusing to say anything else. But every time I would look over at him during the walk back to the cabin, he would already be staring unblinkingly at me. I could almost swear I saw a shadow of something other behind his eyes. It gave me an ominous feeling. Back at the cabin, my sense of unease started to fade away. I felt a rush of triumph. We had won again. We had caught our prey. The sense of control and power we felt during the chase only intensified once we brought him back to the cabin. I mean, deep down, we knew we were doing something others might consider even terrible, something that most people would find abhorrent. But in that moment, I couldn't help but feel invincible, like we were above the law and beyond reproach. We were the masters of our domain, and nothing could stop us. We were invincible. But there was still one thing that nagged at the back of my mind. What was that in the woods earlier? Just the memory of the look in his eyes each time our eyes met was enough to make my skin crawl with anxiety. There is something weird about this guy. I still felt a little sorry for him though, he was just a kid after all. But then I remembered, and the excitement came flooding back. This was what we lived for. We dragged the hitchhiker down to our hidden dungeon. The space was dark and damp with a little mold growing on the walls. Note to self, I should really get on that mold problem. And the scent of decay permeating the air. Well, that is to be expected. Our last visitor was only a few weeks ago. As the seasons change, we are starting to get more and more tourists around these parts. They come for the culture and the quiet. Lots of yoga groups during the summer, but outside of that, we don't get many visitors this far inland, and the population of our small town has been steadily declining over the years. The only light in the dungeon came from a single flickering torch, casting ominous shadows across the room. Michael kicked an old femur out of his way and watched it clatter against the far wall. Then we threw the hitchhiker into a corner and began our work. Michael is always so eager. He pulled out his trusty tools, relishing in the pain that he was about to inflict on our victim. I stood by, watching with a sense of satisfaction as he screamed and begged for mercy. Always a man after my own heart, always so ready, so prepared for anything. It was one of the things that I most liked about him when we first met. I remember once, some 30 odd years ago, I lost my hair tie while we were hiking. It was in these very same woods, and Michael came through clutch with a bobby pin and headscarf from his stuff. Oh, I can't believe I almost thought he was gay. Turns out we were a lot more aligned than we ever knew. Chained to the wall, the hitchhiker screamed in agony as Michael tightened the thumb screws on the first, second, and middle toes of his right foot. Michael had a knack for customizing his weapons, so these thumb screws had spikes embedded in them and they were adjusted to be able to accommodate far more than just a finger or two at a time. Michael customized them himself about a decade ago. Spiked for his ultimate pleasure. I got a little too excited as his toes were crushed. The splatter. It reminded me of squashing a bug in my hands. A few days later, as I descended the dungeon steps, the stench of feces and urine hit me with a ferocity that made me gag. I held my breath and covered my nose with a handkerchief as I walked towards the barred door of the cell. The hitchhiker was lying in the corner of the cell, covered in his own filth. His once pristine clothes were now tattered and stained. His eyes looked hollow and sunken, and his skin was pale and clammy. There were stab wounds covering his arms and torso. I was careful though, we still wanted him alive, for now. We already had a bet going. Michael thinks this guy won't survive as long as our previous guest, but I disagree. I think there is something different about this one, something stronger. There is an anger in his eyes. At face value, you might think he is just a preppy tourist, but I know that he's the type of guy that could stay alive out of pure spite. I pushed the tray of food through the bars and watched as he slowly crawled towards it. He ate with a ravenous hunger as if he hadn't eaten in days. In fact, he probably hadn't. We never intended to keep our guests alive for very long. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something on his wrist. It was a tattoo, a symbol that I had only ever heard of in stories. At least I think that was what I was seeing. It looked ancient, almost mystical, and there was that ominous feeling again, like the hairs on my back were slowing, rising all the way up to the nape of my neck in a slow, spider-like crawl. Michael and I grew up hearing these stories about the old gods from our families. I even had an uncle who fully believed in the old gods and even worshipped them, making sacrifices to them. Was that the symbol of Vashtur? I paused for a moment, studying the symbol. What did it mean? Wait. I narrowed my eyes to focus. Could it be? Is that? No, no, no. This is just another tourist who doesn't respect people's culture enough to find out what symbols mean before getting them tattooed. Who did this hitchhiker really think he was? The sacrilege. Suddenly he looked up at me and our eyes locked. In that moment, I saw that glint of something else in his eyes, something that made me feel uneasy. It was as if he knew something that I didn't, as if he was privy to a secret that only a select few knew. For the briefest of moments, I was scared. I didn't realize it in the moment, but that feeling, that cold, heavy blockage in my throat chakra was fear. I quickly turned and left the dungeon, my heart pounding in my chest. Was this hitchhiker more than he seemed? Of course not. That's why things are going exactly according to plan. Same as they have for the past nearly 40 years. I mentioned the tattoo to Michael. It looks like the mark of Vashtur, I had said. It turns out he had already seen it and deduced exactly what I thought. This hitchhiker is just another grifter who wishes to turn what is sacred into a filthy fad or trend. Who is Vashtur? That's a question I never wanted to have to answer. That name isn't ever spoken without calamity, fast in its wake. Vashtur is an ancient deity of war and pestilence who was believed to bring destruction and disease to humanity. According to Babylonian mythology, Vashtur was also associated with the underworld and the afterlife. It is said that Vashtur was once a powerful warrior and leader of the gods, but was eventually cast out of heaven due to his rebellion against the other deities, and from there he built himself his own pocket realm, an extension of the underworld, far away from the other deities. And as such he became one of the elder gods of this world. Today, however, Vashtur is almost completely forgotten by man. Only a handful of people across the world still acknowledge or worship him, and most of whom have heard the stories do not actually believe them to be true. Legend has it that the last time Vashtur had visited this world, it was during the Great Plague of the 14th century, also known as the Black Death. During that time, it is believed that Vashtur was disguised as a plague doctor, moving among the sick and the dying, watching and observing the hearts of men. But despite his efforts, Vashtur found that humanity had not changed since his previous visit. Greed, corruption, and cruelty still ran rampant, and so Vashtur decreed that humanity was unworthy of life. He unleashed his power and caused even more destruction, wiping out entire cities and leaving death and devastation in his wake. However, as he watched the world burn, Vashtur saw glimmers of hope and goodness among some of the people. He realized that there were those who were fighting against the darkness and striving to make the world a better place. And so he decided to give humanity one more chance. He vanished from the world, but before he left, he made a promise. He would return one day in the flesh of man, marked with a symbol on his wrist, to once again see the heart of man and determine whether this world deserved to go on. The symbol is a circle with a downward-facing arrow in the center, surrounded by 4 smaller arrows pointing outward from the circle at 45-degree angles. The circle represents the cyclical nature of life and death, while the downward arrow symbolizes Vashtur's descent into the underworld as a god of death and the afterlife. The 4 smaller arrows represent the 4 cardinal directions and the idea that Vashtur's power extends throughout the world. At least, that's how the story goes, according to the prophecy, for the lack of a better word. On the hitchhiker's wrist, the symbol was intricate and detailed, with fine lines and delicate shading that give it a sense of depth and complexity. When the light caught it just right, the symbol seemed to glow with an otherworldly energy, hinting at power and ancient wisdom. I must admit, Michael, even at our age, you get better and better at this every time. I beamed at my husband as he held the skin from the hitchhiker's leg aloft. He grinned at me. It's all in the tools, hun. The skin came off so perfectly that I could imagine us literally wrapping it back around his leg from knee to ankle like a blanket. The hitchhiker was whimpering. It was a whimper that expressed that what he was feeling was beyond pain. The minor relief that would generally come from screaming had turned on him, and now it was more painful to let it out. His skinless leg shivered from the shock. The exposed flesh visibly smarted. It was red, but it didn't bleed. Michael's expertise. Next, he would take off thin strips of flesh to cure for later. Michael makes the best jerky, hands down. Thoughts of Michael's jerky swam through my mind for a moment. But then I started to have a strange feeling. As Michael continued to torture the hitchhiker, I could sense a change in the air. The room grew colder and the torch flickered wildly, but there was no wind, especially not in here. The hitchhiker caught my eye. It was almost as if it was the hitchhiker who was causing this, as if he possessed some sort of supernatural power. "Michael, look!" I gasped, barely able to believe my eyes. The hitchhiker's eyes glowed a bright, otherworldly, icy blue, and he opened his mouth as if to speak. "Ah, my God," I gasped. He should have been a hair's breadth away from the end. It was nothing short of miracle that he could speak. His voice was nothing more than a whisper, but it seemed to boom with a power that was not his own. "You are cursed," he said. "The countdown has started. This world will be destroyed." What have we done? Could this really be? As we tried to make sense of the situation, the hitchhiker vanished before our very eyes, leaving us alone in the dark, damp dungeon smelling of death. The symbol of Vashtur burned into the wall. We stared at each other with wide eyes. Michael's skinning knife hit the floor with a clatter. Welcome to App Syndrome, where nightmares come alive. Tonight's creepypasta is the chilling legend of La Llorona, a tale of sorrow, vengeance, and the restless dead. But beware, some legends never rest. I was never a very friendly child, but I was close with my mother. We would always take walks together along the river on the weekends, just the two of us, leaving my older brother and younger sister at home with Dad while he took his evening nap. We lived near this large river that ran through multiple communities. It was so big it was like two massive rivers that met, forming the shape of a Y just above where we lived. The river was mostly slow and lazy. It would curl like a giant snake around the landscape. The water was dark. It always gave me the creeps. I always felt like it had secrets? But I guess what ancient part of nature doesn't, right? 7 children drowned in the river. Of course, there were no bodies. And if you should ask any of the residents about it, they'd simply say the children got washed out to the sea and that's why we aren't finding the bodies. It was easier to blame it on the river, but there were people who thought there was something more sinister going on. There were talks of La Llorona. So naturally, parents started to warn their children against going to the river by themselves. At that time, only certain groups of wayward kids would hang out at the river at odd hours of the day or night. Despite the rumors of missing children, my mother and I continued to take our walks along the river. One evening, it was around dusk. As we were walking, we heard a woman crying. It sounded like her voice was coming from the river itself. My mother, being the compassionate person she was, wanted to investigate. As we got closer to the riverbank, the crying grew louder. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a woman appeared. She was wearing a long white dress and her hair was disheveled. She was crying uncontrollably and kept repeating the phrase, "My children, my children." My mother tried to console her, but the woman just kept crying and didn't seem to notice us. Suddenly, she looked up and saw me. Her crying stopped, and she stared at me with cold, dark eyes. I was frightened, but my mother held my hand tightly, and we tried to back away slowly. But the woman started walking towards us, so my mother stepped in front of me protectively. The woman in white lunged at us. My mother tried to push me out of harm's way, but I stumbled back and fell to the ground, watching and screaming in horror as the woman dragged me by my legs towards the river. But my mother wouldn't let me go. She was strong and she fought back with all her might. I saw her kick and punch the woman, giving me hope that we might make it out alive. Then I felt the water on my legs. A million horrifying thoughts entered my mind. Am I going to drown like all those other children? Is this woman going to hurt my mother? I gasped, doing my best not to swallow water. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my mother managed to break me free from the woman's grasp. We ran as fast as we could back home, my mother holding my hand tightly the whole way. We didn't look back until we were safely inside our house. Breathless and trembling, we collapsed onto the couch. Mom held me close and wept as she recounted to my father what had just happened. She said that the woman was La Llorona. That was the first time I had ever heard of such a woman. La Llorona, the ghost of a woman who drowned her children in the river out of jealousy and now haunted places like it, searching for her lost children. That night, my mother tucked me into bed and promised me that she would never let anything happen to me, and that was enough to scare away any lingering fears I might have had about La Llorona. I was awakened later that night by my little sister. "Something's wrong with Mommy," she whispered. Her eyes were wide and fearful. It was then that I heard a sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life. A low, gurgling noise, like a blockage in a drain that was finally loosening up. I jolted fully awake now, heart pounding in my chest. I could hear my father screaming from the other room, and I knew that something was terribly wrong. I raced to my parents' bedroom with my little sister in tow. There I found my father and brother standing over my mother. She was still in bed. My father's face was twisted in horror. I could barely make out my mother's form in the dim light, but I could see that she was thrashing around, her body convulsing as if in the grip of some terrible force. I wanted to run to her, to hold her and make it all go away, but something held me back. My father was shouting and cursing, his hands shaking as he tried to help her, but it was too late. As I watched, helpless and terrified, my mother sputtered and choked on the water that seemed to be filling her lungs. Her eyes widened in terror, and she reached out to me as if begging for help, but there was nothing I could do. She drowned right there in her own bed while her children watched in horror. The image of her lifeless body would be forever etched into my mind, a reminder of the horror that had befallen us that night. Today I have my own children, 2 little girls. But I do still miss my mother. She would have loved my girls. We live close to a lake and my daughters are both strong swimmers. But a few hours ago, my younger daughter, Angel, came back from the lake carrying a soaking wet, battered-looking teddy bear. "Oh my, where did you get that? Not the floor, don't get it on the floor." I moved quickly, just in time to keep her on the patio, preventing her from dripping lake water all over my living room floor. "Oh, sorry, Mom," she blushed, looking shyly at the ragged bear. "Where did you get that bear, sweetie?" I asked again. "The woman in the white dress gave it to me. Have you seen her children?" was my daughter's response. "What? What did you just say?" I stammered fearfully. I reached out to touch my daughter, but as soon as I felt the freezing cold of her skin, water started to pour out of her eyes and mouth. Then her pores. "Angel!" I screamed. Then she melted into a puddle of cold lake water, leaving the dirty, drowned teddy bear in the puddle. I've since called the police. There is a search now on for my youngest daughter.